August 5, 1943. Albert Speer stood in his Ministry of Armaments office in Berlin, holding a thin folder that weighed more than any battlefield defeat. Inside it was a simple list of production numbers, projections, and supply estimates. There were no combat reports, no maps, no frontline dispatches. Just columns of figures describing Germany's stock of a metal most civilians had never even heard of. Tungsten, the hardest, densest, most critical metal in the German war machine. And those numbers revealed a truth so devastating that Speer realized in that moment that the Third Reich had already lost the war. Germany had 3 months of tungsten left. After that, its tank guns would fail, its armor-piercing shells would become useless, its machine tools would shatter under strain, its factories would grind into a slow, irreversible collapse. And nothing on earth, not tanks, not tactics, not even Hitler's will, could change the mathematics. Speer stared at the final line on the last page. Projected consumption exceeds available supply by 400%. 400%. A figure that would have been unbelievable if Speer had not already seen the consequences on the battlefield. Anti-tank gunners whispering that their rounds were soft. Machinists reporting tools breaking twice as fast. Tank crews discovering that their precious armor-piercing shells were punching dents instead of holes in Soviet armor. And yet Speer did not understand the whole truth. He did not know that this crisis began years earlier, not in the factories of the Reich, but in the mountains of Portugal and Spain. He did not know that the British and Americans were waging a secret economic war for control of this one metal. And he did not know that tungsten, not oil, not steel, not rubber, would quietly strangle the Wehrmacht's ability to fight long before Allied armies reached Germany's borders. To understand why, you must understand what tungsten was in World War II. Tungsten was not a luxury. It was not optional. It was the single most important element in Germany's armor-piercing ammunition. When a tungsten core shell hit a tank, it did not flatten or crumble. It sliced through armor like a hot knife. Tungsten made German anti-tank weapons lethal. It made their tank guns deadly. It allowed German factories to cut hardened steel precisely. Without tungsten, Germany's shells bent, cracked, or simply bounced off enemy armor. Germany could produce all the tanks it wanted, but if the shells could not penetrate, they meant nothing. Tungsten was the difference between life and death for a tank crew, and Germany had almost none. Before the war, Germany imported between 80 and 90% of its tungsten. The two biggest suppliers were Portugal and Spain, neutral nations, independent, outside Hitler's control. During the first years of the war, German agents flooded Iberia with cash, gold, and diplomatic pressure. They bought every ton of tungsten they could. They set up front companies. They bribed mine owners. They doubled and tripled prices. A black market gold rush swept across rural Portugal. Farmers abandoned fields to dig tungsten with their bare hands. Miners called it the Wolfram fever. And for a time, the fever kept Germany alive. But the British knew, the Americans knew, and they began their own campaign, not to use tungsten themselves, but to deny it to the Reich. The Allied strategy was simple and ruthless: outbid the Germans for every ounce on the market. It didn't matter if they paid 5 times the price, 10 times, 100 times. Whatever Germany paid, the Allies paid more. Entire shipments disappeared from train stations hours before German buyers arrived. Portuguese officials received envelopes full of American dollars. Spanish smugglers were offered bonuses for sabotaging German shipments. Intelligence agents forged purchase contracts. Shell companies created fictional buyers who never intended to pick up their ore. It was economic warfare, silent but brutal, and it inflicted deeper wounds than any bomb or artillery strike. By the end of 1942, the Allies were winning the Tungsten War. Portugal, under increasing British pressure, began imposing export restrictions to the Axis. Spain followed slowly. and Germany's once steady supply evaporated. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. German anti-tank units reported penetration irregularities, a polite way of saying their shells no longer worked. Tungsten core ammunition was replaced with inferior steel versions, steel that folded, shattered, or ricocheted harmlessly off T-34 armor. German tank commanders complained that Soviet tanks were surviving direct hits that should have guaranteed kills. Dozens of reports poured in describing shells pinging off enemy armor at close range, the kind of failure that destroys morale and lives. The tungsten shortage also crippled German industry. Machine tools require tungsten carbide cutters to shape hardened steel. Without them, factories could only produce lower quality parts. Tool wear skyrocketed, production slowed, precision declined, tolerances slipped. Aircraft engines required perfect machining to survive at high temperatures. Without tungsten tools, quality control failures soared. German aircraft engines began failing sooner. Tank components wore out faster. Every machine in every factory became less reliable. Germany was still producing weapons, but they were weaker, more fragile, less deadly. A silent decay spreading through the entire industrial bloodstream of the Reich. And yet, Hitler barely understood the crisis. He had no technical background. He did not grasp metallurgy. When Speer tried to explain the importance of tungsten, Hitler grew irritated. He believed willpower mattered more than raw materials. He insisted Germany could invent around shortages. He told his staff, "We will find substitutes." But there was no substitute for tungsten, not in 1943. Not in 1944. Not ever. You cannot replace the hardest metal on Earth with iron or hope, and Berlin was now paying the price. German tungsten consumption during the peak war years was approximately 6,000 tons per year. German domestic production was less than 100 tons. With imports collapsing, the gap became impossible to hide. In 1943, Germany obtained barely 1/3 of the tungsten it needed. In 1944, that number dropped below 10%. By 1945, German tungsten supply was statistically zero. A modern industrial state fighting a mechanized war without the metal needed to make armor-piercing ammunition. The math was apocalyptic. But the crisis was not just industrial. It was deeply psychological. German tank crews grew terrified. They knew the Soviets were fielding thicker armor. They knew tungsten rounds were disappearing. A Soviet T-34-85 could shrug off a German steel-core anti-tank round even at point-blank range. In 1942, a German panzer crew could rely on their gun to kill anything they faced. By 1944, that confidence was gone. German gunners whispered that their shots were worthless. Officers requested tungsten ammunition that simply did not exist. Tank commanders began aiming for tracks, vision slits, and gun barrels, not to kill, but simply to disable. A humiliating downgrade for an army once feared for its armor dominance. And on the Eastern Front, the Soviets knew. Soviet intelligence monitored tungsten production across Europe. They understood that German anti-tank effectiveness had dropped sharply. Soviet tank brigades began using more aggressive formations. Attacks that would have been suicidal in 1941 now succeeded because German shells no longer penetrated. At Kursk, tungsten shortages forced Germany to ration armor-piercing rounds. Tiger and Panther crews saved prized tungsten core shells for the heaviest targets. Everyone else was left with inferior steel versions. After the battle, German officers reported hundreds of hits on Soviet armor that failed to penetrate. Not because of poor aim, because the materials simply weren't there. The most devastating consequence came in 1943, when the German army attempted to develop new anti-tank weaponry. High-velocity cannon designs required tungsten-based tooling to machine barrels and breech components. Without tungsten tools, production capacity was cut sharply. Promising designs were delayed or canceled. The famous Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket suffered from inconsistent warhead quality due to machining issues. The entire process of improving German firepower stalled. Germany was trapped fighting a 20th century war with weapons that were becoming 19th century quality. Meanwhile, the Allies tightened the noose. In 1944, Portugal, Germany's most important supplier, announced a full embargo on tungsten exports to the Axis. Berlin was furious. Hitler ranted that Portugal had become an English colony. But words did not matter. The war was lost the moment the mines of Portugal closed their doors to German buyers. It was as if someone had turned off the oxygen supply. Within months, German tungsten stocks fell below military minimums. Speer authorized emergency rationing. No tungsten for practice ammunition. No tungsten for machine tools outside priority factories. No tungsten for naval guns. It all went to the Eastern Front, and even then it wasn't enough. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was facing an enemy whose armor was growing thicker, at the exact moment that its own ammunition was growing weaker. Soviet IS-2 heavy tanks were nearly impervious to German steel core rounds at common engagement ranges. German gunners often needed to close to suicidal distances to disable one. The result was predictable. German tank losses soared. Anti-tank gun crews suffered catastrophic casualties. Infantry had to rely on handheld weapons that could not stop the heaviest Soviet armor. It was a death spiral in slow motion. The tungsten crisis also crippled Germany's ability to repair and rebuild. Machine tools lacking tungsten carbide edges wore out in days rather than weeks. Entire factories slowed to a crawl. Precision components could not be milled. Aircraft engines failed on test stands. Panzer transmissions wore out faster than production could replace them. Even the V-2 rocket program struggled as machining tolerances drifted. A rocket is a machine that must be perfect. Germany could no longer manufacture perfection. When Allied bombers destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel plants in 1944, the fuel crisis became headline news. But the tungsten crisis had already crippled Germany long before that. Without tungsten, the German war machine was like a tank without a gun barrel. It looked dangerous. It sounded dangerous, but it could not fight. By 1945, German officers openly admitted that their weapons were failing. In post-war interrogations, Albert Speer said, "Tungsten was our most severe material shortage, more severe even than oil. It weakened our weapons from the inside out." General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, wrote that by 1944, our anti-tank guns lacked the punch needed to stop Soviet armor. We no longer had the necessary tungsten to manufacture effective ammunition. Even Allied intelligence analysts were surprised at how quickly the shortage undermined German firepower. A British report from late 1943 stated bluntly, "Germany's inability to acquire tungsten will reduce its anti-tank capabilities by 50% within 12 months. The prediction was optimistic. The real drop was closer to 70%. In the end, the Tungsten War was not fought on battlefields. It was fought in mountain mines, in diplomatic backrooms, in smuggler networks, in economic negotiations. It was won by Portuguese mine workers, British intelligence officers, American purchasing agents, and Spanish smugglers who diverted trains in the night. It was won by supply and demand economics, by neutral governments refusing to be bullied, by the simple fact that Germany could not manufacture the hardest metal on earth out of thin air. Hitler believed willpower and ideology would win the war, but wars are not won by speeches. Wars are won by resources, by the metals that make weapons lethal, by the materials that keep machines running. Germany lost not because it lacked courage or strategy, but because it lacked tungsten. Tiny, dense, irreplaceable pieces of metal that determined whether a shell broke armor or bounced off it. This is how World War II was actually decided, not just in Stalingrad or Normandy, but in the mines of Portugal and Spain. In the global marketplaces where Britain and America bought every ounce of strategic material they could find. In the economic battlefield where Germany was outspent, outmaneuvered, and ultimately outmatched. If this hidden economic history of the war fascinated you, subscribe to the channel. In this series, we uncover how battles were won not only by soldiers, but by supply chains, minerals, and industrial strategy. Comment below where you're watching from, and tell us what other secret wars of resources you want us to explore. And stay tuned,